200 United States Marines. Tanks. Air support. Enough firepower to level a city block. They tried for 72 hours. 3 of them died. And when it was over, the Taliban flag was still flying. 3 weeks later, 6 British soldiers walked toward the same enemy position. No armor. No artillery. No fast jets circling overhead. Just 6 men, their rifles, the darkness, and something the Taliban had not counted on. Within 8 hours, it was over. What happened in that compound, in the cold pre-dawn darkness of Helmand Province, would be studied in military academies, debated in classified briefings, and whispered among soldiers on both sides of the Atlantic for years to come. Because what 6 SAS men did that night, what 200 Marines could not, raises a question that goes to the very heart of how wars are actually won. And the answer will change the way you think about combat forever. Stay with me. October 2010. Nad-e-Ali District. Helmand Province, Afghanistan. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about what soldiers are truly asked to carry, not just in battle but long after it ends, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. Subscribe to British Military Chronicles. Every day we go deep into the stories that shaped the British military, the operations that never made headlines, the men who never sought recognition, and the moments that defined what it means to serve. Hit the bell so you never miss one. And I'll see you in the next video. 6 men moved through a maze of dried mud walls in absolute silence. No identification patches on their uniforms. Their weapons were customized well beyond standard issue. Each man carried exactly what he needed, nothing more, nothing less. The temperature had dropped to near freezing in the pre-dawn darkness, but not one of them shivered. They had learned long ago that unnecessary movement betrayed position. And in this particular corner of Afghanistan, position meant the difference between life and death. They were soldiers from 22 Special Air Service Regiment, operating under call sign Sabre 16. Their mission was simple to state and nearly impossible to execute: clear a Taliban stronghold that had resisted every coalition attempt to dislodge it for 4 straight months. The target was a cluster of compounds deep in the Green Zone, that narrow, suffocating band of farmland along the Helmand River where opium money, foreign fighters, and deep local grievance had created something closer to a fortress than a village. Intelligence estimated between 40 and 60 Taliban fighters were dug in behind walls thick enough to stop .50 caliber rounds. 3 weeks earlier, a full company of United States Marines, roughly 200 men, had attempted to take the same position. They brought armored vehicles. They brought close air support. They brought enough ammunition to level a city block. The operation lasted 72 hours. It cost 3 American lives, with 14 more wounded, before commanders made the painful decision to pull back. When the Marines withdrew, the Taliban flag was still flying over the main compound wall. The message was unmistakable. This ground belonged to the enemy. And they intended to keep it. Now, 6 British soldiers were walking toward the same objective with nothing but what they could carry on their backs. No armor. No artillery. No aircraft circling overhead ready to drop precision munitions at the first sign of trouble. Just 6 men, their rifles, and a plan that any conventional military planner who read it on paper would have rejected outright as suicidal. Within 8 hours, every Taliban fighter in that stronghold would be dead, or running. The Marines who watched the aftermath used words that kept appearing, again and again, in their reports and their letters home. Words like humbled, shocked, inadequate, and one phrase that became something close to legend among the units rotating through Helmand in the years that followed. Those British bastards fight like it's still 1879, and somehow, it works. This is the story of what happened when 2 military cultures collided in the most dangerous province in Afghanistan. One culture built on overwhelming firepower and technological superiority. The other built on something older, harder to measure, and far more frightening to face at close range. To understand why 6 SAS soldiers could achieve what 200 Marines could not, you have to first understand where both armies came from, and what shaped them into the forces they became. The United States Marine Corps in 2010 was the most technologically advanced fighting force in human history. A single Marine infantry company had access to more raw firepower than entire divisions possessed during the Second World War. They trained with night vision technology that turned complete darkness into green daylight. They carried radios capable of calling in precision airstrikes from aircraft circling at 20,000 feet. Their doctrine was built around a simple, proven, and highly effective principle: identify the enemy, fix them in place, and destroy them with superior firepower delivered from distances that kept American casualties to an absolute minimum. This was not cowardice. This was professionalism at the highest level. Why risk a Marine's life clearing a building room by room when a single Hellfire missile could reduce that entire building to rubble in seconds? The technology existed. The training supported it. The American public expected it. And for most of the wars America fought in the modern era, that doctrine worked remarkably well. The SAS came from a very different place. The regiment was born in 1941 in the North African desert, when a young lieutenant named David Stirling convinced his superiors that small teams of supremely trained soldiers could achieve more behind enemy lines than entire battalions attacking from the front. The concept was elegant in its simplicity: move unseen, strike hard, disappear before the enemy knows what hit them. Repeat until the enemy stops sleeping. Over the following 7 decades, the SAS fought in environments where technology mattered far less than raw human skill. In Malaya during the 1950s, where the enemy hid in jungles so thick that helicopters were useless and survival depended on learning to move through vegetation without making a single sound. In Borneo in the 1960s, conducting deep raids inside Indonesian territory where resupply was impossible and every round of ammunition had to be justified before the patrol even left base camp. And for 38 years in Northern Ireland, where the difference between a terrorist and an innocent civilian was a judgment call made in half a second on a dark street, where hesitation could cost lives and shooting the wrong person could restart an entire war. The SAS learned to trust small numbers, light loads, and decisions made by the men on the ground, not by commanders sitting in operations rooms miles away. They learned that the most powerful weapon was often not the biggest gun, but the one that made no noise at all. They learned that true speed was not measured in how fast you moved, but in how quickly you could transition from invisible to lethal, and back to invisible again. By 2010, both armies had been fighting side by side in Afghanistan for nearly a decade. They shared intelligence. They coordinated operations. They respected each other in the way that professionals always do. But beneath the surface, a tension ran deep, one that no number of liaison meetings could resolve. The Americans looked at British light infantry tactics and saw unnecessary risk. The British looked at American dependence on technology and saw soldiers who had quietly forgotten how to fight without it. The Nad-e-Ali operation was about to settle that argument. Not through debate. Through results, written in blood and dust. The compound cluster sat in the green zone, a narrow band of farmland along the Helmand River where irrigation ditches and dense vegetation created a maze that overwhelmingly favored the defender. The main building was 3 stories tall, unusual in a region where most structures were single-level mud brick. From the roof, Taliban spotters had clear sight lines in every direction. Approach from the north and you crossed open poppy fields in full view. Approach from the south and you walked straight into a kill zone where intersecting machine gun positions covered every meter of ground with murderous overlap. The Marines had approached from the north in August with a textbook assault. Armored vehicles moved forward to provide covering fire. Infantry advanced in tactical bounds, one squad moving while another provided suppression. Close air support circled overhead. Everything executed precisely by the book. The Taliban let them come. They waited until the lead elements were committed, fully exposed in the open fields, and then they opened up with everything they had. PKM machine guns. rocket-propelled grenades. Sniper fire from the upper floors that found gaps in body armor with a terrifying, almost clinical accuracy. The Marines called in air strikes. Paveway bombs turned 2 outlying buildings into smoking craters, but the main compound's walls were simply too thick. The bombs collapsed roofs, but left the core structure standing and the fighters inside it very much alive. For 3 days the Marines traded fire with an enemy they could rarely see. They were certainly killing Taliban fighters. Intelligence estimates suggested at least 15 enemy dead in those first 72 hours. But reinforcements filtered in at night through irrigation ditches that American thermal imaging could not penetrate, because the water temperature matched the surrounding mud perfectly. For every fighter killed, another appeared before dawn. On the 3rd day, a Marine Lance Corporal named Christopher Mendez was shot through the neck by a sniper firing from the compound's 3rd floor. The round severed his carotid artery. He bled out in 90 seconds while his squad frantically worked to stop the bleeding. He was 21 years old. He was from San Diego. In his last letter home, he had told his mother that the Taliban were good fighters, better than anyone had admitted, and that this deployment was nothing like anything they had trained for. Following his death, commanders made the decision to withdraw. The position was not worth more American lives. They would isolate it, monitor it, and wait for a better opportunity. The Marines pulled back under covering fire, carrying their dead and wounded with them. Behind them, the Taliban repainted their flag on the compound wall, and waited for the next attempt. The British watched all of this through their own intelligence channels. The SAS liaison officer at Camp Bastion, a major who had spent 4 tours in Helmand, wrote a brief analysis that circulated through UK Special Forces Command. The words were plain and direct. The Americans tried to destroy the position. That will never work. The walls are too thick and the Taliban too dug in. This requires precision, not power. This requires men who can get inside the perimeter before the enemy knows they are there. 3 weeks later, Sabre 16 received their orders. The planning session lasted 4 hours. 6 men sat in a bare concrete room at a classified location south of Lashkar Gah. No rank insignia. No formality. Just professionals solving a problem. The team leader was a staff sergeant from Hereford with 12 years in the regiment and operational experience spanning Iraq, Syria, and 3 previous tours in Afghanistan. His call sign was Sabre 16 Alpha. Everyone called him boss, not because he demanded it, but because when he made a decision, nobody questioned it. His second was a Fijian corporal built like a brick wall who could carry more weight than men 6 inches taller. The rest of the team were a mix of the finest soldiering talent Britain produced, a former Royal Marine sniper, a Welshman who spoke Pashto well enough to pass as local in poor light, a demolition specialist from the Parachute Regiment, and a signaller with access to intelligence assets the Americans did not even know existed. They studied every piece of intelligence available. Drone footage. Intercepts of Taliban radio traffic. Interviews with local civilians who lived near the compound. Reports from the Marine operation, including precise grid coordinates of where the enemy had fired from and detailed estimates of weapon types and positioning. The SAS planning method differed fundamentally from American standard operating procedure. The Americans build detailed operation orders with contingencies for every possible scenario. The SAS built a framework, and trusted their men to adapt in the moment. The framework for Nad-e-Ali was straightforward. Infiltrate at night through the same irrigation ditches the Taliban used for resupply. Reach the western wall, the point the enemy would least expect an assault. Breach that wall with a precisely placed charge. Clear the buildings room by room in total darkness using suppressed weapons and night vision. Kill or capture every fighter inside before dawn. Extract before Taliban reinforcements could arrive. The American officers briefed on the plan, not for approval, but simply for deconfliction, thought it was borderline insane. 6 men against 40 to 60 entrenched fighters in a defensive position that had just repelled a company-strength assault? The Marine intelligence officer asked the SAS liaison a direct question. What happens if your team makes contact before they reach the wall? The liaison answered without hesitation. They won't. They moved out at 0200 hours on the 18th of October. The night was cold and completely moonless. Cloud cover had blocked out the stars. Visibility for the naked eye was perhaps 10 meters, if you were lucky. For men wearing 4-tube night vision equipment, the world glowed in shifting shades of green that revealed every rock, every ditch, every shadow. The insertion point was 3 kilometers from the target. Far enough that helicopter noise would not alert the Taliban. Close enough to move into position before dawn. They walked in single file through fields harvested weeks earlier. Dry stalks crunched underfoot with each step, but the team moved with a physical discipline that made the sound negligible at any distance. Each man tested his footing before committing his full weight. Each step took 3 to 4 seconds to complete. To an outside observer, it would have looked agonizingly, frustratingly slow. To the SAS, this was simply standard pace. At 0245 they reached the first irrigation ditch. The water was waist-deep and cold enough to take your breath if you weren't prepared for it. They slipped in without a sound and began moving south toward the target. The ditch was narrow, barely a meter wide in places. Thorny vegetation overhung both sides. They moved through it like shadows, placing each foot with absolute care to avoid any splash, any sound that might carry. Taliban sentries stood on the compound roof 400 meters ahead. The SAS could see them clearly through their night vision, 2 men smoking cigarettes, one positioned behind a PKM machine gun on a tripod. They were relaxed. Unhurried. Why wouldn't they be? Every coalition force that had ever approached this position had done so with vehicles and air support, loud, obvious, visible from a kilometer away. The SAS were now 200 meters out. The sentries had not moved. No alert. No change in posture. The team kept moving. At 0330 they reached the compound's outer wall. 3 meters of dried mud brick, reinforced with timber beams, its surface pockmarked from the marine bombardment 3 weeks earlier. Some sections had partially collapsed, but every one of those gaps was covered by Taliban fire positions. The SAS had chosen a different breach point entirely, the western wall, facing away from every expected approach, where no enemy fighter in that compound would logically expect an assault to come from. The demolition specialist moved forward with a frame charge, a shaped explosive designed to blow a precise hole through the wall without bringing the entire structure down around them. He placed it carefully, ran the det cord back to the detonator, and the team stacked on either side of the breach point. Weapons up. Safeties off. Night vision active. Breathing controlled. The team leader made a single-hand signal. Breach. The charge detonated with a sharp crack that echoed across the green zone. It blew a hole through the wall large enough for a man to step through cleanly. Before the dust had even begun to settle, the first SAS soldier was already through and moving. What happened in the next 6 minutes defied nearly every established principle of modern infantry combat. There were no radios calling for external support. No pauses to establish fire superiority. No suppressing fire laid down to cover movement. Just 6 men moving through a defended compound in total darkness with a speed and precision that left the enemy no time, no space, to react. The first Taliban fighter they encountered was standing in a courtyard 10 meters from the breach point. He had heard the explosion and was turning toward the sound when the lead SAS trooper shot him twice in the chest with a suppressed 416 Hong Kong dollars. The report was no louder than 2 hands clapping. The man dropped without a sound. The team split into 2 elements without a spoken word. 3 men moved left toward the main building. 3 moved right toward the outlying structures where intelligence had suggested weapons and fighters were quartered. They moved without speaking, every man knowing his role, every corner cleared with the same drill they had rehearsed 10,000 times in training. One man covers. One man moves. Third man watches the rear. In the dark. In silence. Under fire. Without radio communication. In the main building, the SAS found Taliban fighters waking to the sound of gunfire that was already inside their own perimeter. Most of them never reached their weapons. The British moved through rooms faster than the enemy's mind could process what was happening to them. Suppressed rifles fired in short, controlled bursts. 2 rounds, center mass. Move to the next target. No hesitation. No pause. A Taliban commander emerged from a side room clutching an AK-47. The Fijian corporal shot him in the face before the man's rifle came level. The commander fell backward into the room he had just stepped out of. The corporal stepped over his body and cleared the room beyond. Empty. He moved on. On the roof, the 2 sentries who had been smoking cigarettes heard the chaos erupting below them and tried to respond. They grabbed the PKM and swung it toward the stairwell. The SAS sniper, positioned outside the compound with a suppressed L-115A3, put a single round through the first sentry's skull at 180 meters. The second sentry froze for just a fraction of a second. The sniper's second shot took him in the chest. Both men collapsed without firing a single round from the machine gun. The team that had moved toward the outlying structures found exactly what intelligence had promised. Crates of ammunition stacked to the ceiling. RPG rounds piled like firewood. Explosive materials for roadside bombs. And 12 Taliban fighters sleeping in a barrack-style room who opened their eyes to find British soldiers standing over them with rifles pointed directly at their faces. The Welsh trooper issued a command in fluent Pashto. Hands up. Do not move. The fighters looked at each other. One reached slowly for an AK-47 leaning against the wall beside him. The Welsh trooper shot him. By 03:45 hours, 15 minutes after the breach, the compound was secure. 23 Taliban fighters were dead. 12 more were flex-cuffed and sitting against a wall under guard. The rest had run, disappearing into the darkness through gaps in the northern wall, leaving blood trails in the dust behind them. The team leader called it in to headquarters. His voice was steady and unhurried. Objective secure. Request immediate casevac for enemy wounded and transport for detainees. The American Quick Reaction Force that had been standing by 3 kilometers away mounted up and drove hard toward the compound. When they arrived 20 minutes later, they found the 6 SAS soldiers calmly and methodically searching the bodies and documenting captured weapons. A Marine captain stepped through the hole in the western wall and stopped dead. He looked at the bodies on the ground. He looked at the 6 British soldiers who were not even breathing hard. He looked at his own men who had attempted to take this same position 3 weeks earlier with 200 Marines and failed. He stood in silence for a long moment. Then he turned to the SAS team leader and asked the question that would be repeated in every debrief and after-action report written about Nad-e-Ali for years to come. How the hell did you do that? The question the Marine captain asked that morning was the same question American commanders had been quietly asking about British Special Forces for years. And the answer, when you actually dig into it, is not what most people expect to hear. Technology was not the answer. The SAS used night vision, certainly, but so did the Marines. They used suppressed weapons, but American Special Operations Forces had access to identical equipment. They had radios but called in no external support during the entire assault. The difference was not in the tools. The difference was in what the men using those tools fundamentally believed about how wars are actually won. The SAS operated on a principle that traced back directly to David Stirling in 1941, and before him to a tradition of irregular warfare stretching back centuries through British military history. Small teams of supremely trained soldiers, operating with near-total autonomy, could achieve objectives that large conventional forces could not because they had better weapons, but because they willingly accepted levels of risk that conventional forces had been specifically trained to avoid. The Marine assault on Nad-e-Ali had been textbook: establish fire superiority, suppress the enemy, advance under covering fire, call in air support when resistance stiffens. Every step carefully designed to minimize friendly casualties. That doctrine had worked in Iraq, where the enemy fought from urban positions that could be leveled with precision munitions. It worked less well in Afghanistan, where the enemy was dug into compounds with walls thick enough to survive direct bomb strikes, and skilled enough to retreat through tunnels and irrigation ditches before air support even arrived on station. For every fighter killed from the air, another appeared before dawn. The SAS approach inverted the entire equation. Instead of minimizing risk, they accepted it, and managed it through speed and skill. Instead of announcing their presence with vehicles and aircraft, they infiltrated silently and struck before the enemy knew they existed. Instead of relying on technology to keep them safe, they relied on training refined through 70 years of continuous operations in every environment on Earth. And it was the training that made the decisive difference. Every SAS trooper had survived selection, a process so physically and psychologically brutal that roughly 90% of candidates failed to complete it. Those who passed then spent months in continuation training, acquiring skills that conventional infantry rarely touched. Advanced combat medicine, demolitions, language training, surveillance and intelligence gathering. And above all else, close quarters battle, drilled to the point where muscle memory took over completely when conscious thought shut down under the weight of fear and adrenaline. An SAS team clearing a building did not think about what to do next. They simply did it. The first man through the door already knew where he was moving before he crossed the threshold. The second man knew precisely which corner was his responsibility. The third knew when to enter and where to position. All of this happened in darkness. In silence. Under fire. Without radio communication, because they had rehearsed it so many thousands of times that speaking would only have slowed them down. Marines who watched the SAS operate in Helmand described it in their reports with a mixture of genuine admiration and quiet frustration. One lieutenant wrote that watching the British clear rooms was like watching a machine. No wasted movement. No hesitation. Just smooth, terrifying efficiency. Another wrote something that cut deeper still: I feel like my own training taught me to fight carefully. The SAS were taught to fight like fighting was the only thing that mattered. But there was something else. Something harder to quantify and uncomfortable for many American officers to acknowledge openly. The SAS accepted casualties in a way that modern American forces no longer did, and had not done for a long time. This was not recklessness. The SAS were not suicidal. But they operated with the clear, unspoken understanding that some missions required men to close with the enemy at ranges where people died, and that if the mission was important enough, those deaths were an acceptable cost. The American military in 2010, shaped by 2 decades of low-casualty operations and a domestic public that had come to demand something approaching zero tolerance for losses, had largely moved away from that older calculus. Technology existed to keep soldiers safe. Using it fully was not just tactically smart, it had become a moral obligation. The British, and the SAS in particular, had never abandoned the older understanding. Wars were ultimately won by men willing to put themselves in harm's way when no alternative existed. Technology helped. Training helped. But in the end, someone had to walk through that door where the enemy was waiting. The SAS were willing to be those men. They had built an entire institution around that single, uncommon willingness. The Nad-e-Ali operation became required study at the Marine Corps Mountain Warfare Training Center. Officers analyzed the tactics, broke down the timeline, and studied every weapons and movement decision the SAS had made. And in classified briefings, senior commanders quietly acknowledged what the operation had laid bare: the Marines had become so dependent on firepower and technology that they had allowed something fundamental to erode: the ability to close with and destroy the enemy when all the machines and radios and aircraft were stripped away. The political dimension was delicate and potentially explosive. The United States had over 90,000 troops in Afghanistan in 2010. Britain had roughly 9,500. The Americans provided the majority of air support, logistics, and intelligence infrastructure that made the entire coalition effort possible. The British were junior partners in every measurable respect, except one. Their special forces were achieving results that American commanders simply could not ignore. General David Petraeus, commanding all coalition forces in Afghanistan, personally requested an increased SAS presence in Helmand Province. The request was approved, but the numbers remained small by necessity. The entire 22 SAS regiment numbered fewer than 300 combat-ready soldiers at any given time, spread across multiple theaters simultaneously. Afghanistan got what could be spared, which was never as many as commanders wanted. Intelligence analysts estimated that SAS operations in 2010 alone killed or captured over 300 Taliban fighters, including 47 identified commanders, all achieved by fewer than 60 SAS soldiers rotating through Helmand during that year. The Taliban noticed. Intercepted communications from late 2010 showed a clear and consistent pattern. When Taliban commanders identified British forces in an area, particularly special forces, their guidance to subordinates was uniform: avoid contact, withdraw if engaged, do not hold fixed positions against them. One intercepted message became legendary among coalition intelligence officers. A Taliban sub-commander in Sanjin sent a warning to his fighters that read, in translation: "The Americans call airplanes and hide. The British come to your house at night, and they do not leave until you are dead. If you hear they are coming, run." But the human cost of operations like these was paid by men whose names rarely appeared in any news report. The SAS does not celebrate its soldiers publicly. There are no press conferences, no medal ceremonies broadcast on television. When an SAS trooper dies, his death is frequently reported under the name of a cover unit: the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, the Rifles, any regiment except the one he actually served. Trooper David Sharp was killed in Helmand in 2011. He was 27 years old. His death was reported as a soldier from the Rifles. In truth, he was SAS. He died clearing a compound similar to Nad-e-Ali when a Taliban fighter hiding in a crawl space detonated a suicide vest. Sharp had been first through the door. He took the full force of the blast. His body was so severely damaged that his team could identify him only from DNA and the serial number on his rifle. His funeral was attended by men who could not publicly acknowledge what unit they served in. They wore civilian clothes. They did not speak to reporters. One of them, a fellow trooper who had served with Sharp through 3 deployments, wrote a private letter to Sharp's parents. It was never published, but the family later shared portions with a researcher compiling a classified history of SAS operations in Afghanistan. "David was the best of us, not because he was the strongest or the fastest. Because when it mattered, when lives were on the line, he went first. Every time. No hesitation. The Taliban killed him, but they could not stop him. He cleared that room. He saved the men following behind him. That is who your son was." The psychological cost was just as real, and far less visible. SAS troopers who survived multiple tours in Helmand came home carrying memories that neither therapy nor time could fully erase. The sound of a child screaming in a compound you had just breached. The face of a teenager reaching for a rifle who looked young enough to still be in school. The smell of burning following a grenade detonation in a confined space. The weight of a friend's body when you carry him out, because leaving him behind is simply not an option you will ever consider. Some adapted. They left the regiment, started families, found ways to live alongside what they had experienced and what they had done. Others did not. Veterans organizations estimate that at least a dozen SAS soldiers who served in Afghanistan have taken their own lives since the war ended. Men who had survived firefights and bomb blasts and wounds that by any reasonable measure should have killed them, but could not survive the silence that followed the war, when the purpose that had sustained them was suddenly gone. The deeper truth that Nad-e-Ali and operations like it revealed was a fundamental tension in modern warfare that no amount of technology could resolve. Western militaries had spent trillions of dollars developing weapons systems designed to kill enemies from distances that kept their own soldiers safe. Drones striking from 20,000 feet. Artillery firing from 30 kilometers behind the front. Aircraft capable of destroying targets without ever being seen or engaged. All of this worked superbly in conventional wars between nation-states with identifiable armies and strategic targets that could be located and destroyed. It worked less well, sometimes not at all, against enemies who hid among civilians, operated from compounds indistinguishable from ordinary homes, and measured their own victory not in territory held, but simply in their ability to survive and keep fighting. Against that kind of enemy, someone eventually had to walk through the door. Someone had to put their hands on the problem and solve it with skill and controlled violence at ranges measured in meters, not kilometers. The SAS never forgot this. They never allowed themselves the comfortable belief that machines could substitute for human skill and human will. They trained specifically for the worst-case scenario, where the radios failed, the air support could not reach you, and the only thing standing between you and death was your own competence and the man fighting beside you. That training produced soldiers who shocked even their closest allies. Soldiers who could walk into hell outnumbered 10 to 1, and walk back out victorious. Not because they were superhuman, but because they had accepted a bargain that most modern armies had quietly and gradually abandoned. We will take the risks no one else will take. We will do the jobs no one else will do. And when we die knowing we gave everything, and held nothing back. The compound at Nad-e-Ali stands empty now. The Taliban returned to power in August 2021. Every meter of ground that coalition forces had bled for, every compound cleared, every road secured, every life spent, was returned without negotiation or ceremony. The men who died there, British and American alike, died for a cause that ultimately failed in the political sense. But the soldiers who fought there, the ones who survived, carry something that failure cannot erase. They know, with absolute certainty, what they are capable of. They know that when everything else was stripped away, the technology, the air support, the overwhelming firepower, they stood in the darkness, and they fought. With their hands and their rifles and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The SAS trooper who led Sabre 16 retired in 2015. He lives quietly in Herefordshire now. He does not give interviews. He does not write memoirs. In the only conversation he ever had about Nad-e-Ali, with a researcher he trusted and had known for years, he was asked a simple question. Why did the operation succeed when the Marine assault had failed? His answer was brief. And it was devastating in its simplicity. The Marines tried to destroy the position. We tried to take it. When you are willing to walk through that door, not knowing what is on the other side, you will always beat someone who wants to knock the building down from a distance. Not because you are braver. Because you have accepted what war actually is. And most armies have not. That acceptance is what separates the SAS from nearly every other military force in the world. It is why 6 men could do what 200 could not. And it is why, when the next war comes, and the machines fail, and the easy options run out, someone will have to walk through that door. The SAS will be first in line. They always are.